Dark tidings, dear friends. Here in the Crypt to share the journey of our hero Count Orlok, Nosferatu. To the land beyond the forest. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. A journey then to consider if our industry is literally sucking the lifeblood out of investors, or else offers some symbiotic value. But into those woods, monsters do lurk. Yes, monsters. Natalie Lawrence at the Department of History and Philosophy of Science, Cambridge, explored what is a monster, citing Dr. Walter Palmer, aka the dentist, who legally shot Cecil the lion in Zimbabwe, creating outrage in social media, forcing him to flee his home, close his business, the receiving of death threats, and in doing so deemed trophy hunting a monstrosity. And Natalie wrote that such public monsters serve a similar role to Gothic monsters, images that embody the cultural or psychological characteristics that we as a society find difficult to acknowledge. By excising them through fantasies of execution or simply professional exclusion, we rid ourselves of the undesirable attributes they are perceived to carry. Monsters like the Mummy. From the monster from the Black Lagoon to the Bernie Madoff Ponzi scheme. And so, like Walter Palmer, asset management faces a change in society perception made of damaged public trust in a way we could not fully fathom then or now. Once damaged, trust cannot be simply repaired. It weakens the resilience of reputation every time a new scandal hits. Individuals we can identify that polarise opinion in society and social media, whether it is the narrative of dictators and oppression, or the wolves in the boiler rooms, to sociopaths that literally shake popular culture, to even bankers. Since 2008, the word bankers, other than becoming a popular rhyming slang, has become toxic in popular culture, and so too for asset management. And more recently we have created a new monster, the Star Manager. And much has been said about Woodford, some true, some speculation, some unbiased, some not. Yet Woodford Capital did much to be criticised for. Fund suspensions and the delay to refund investors merely served to add to the sense of victimisation, images of impoverished small investors and retirees. A sense, again, of monstrosity. Disgraced star managers are the new bankers. It has thus become compelling to cast out the monsters, to light our torches and arm our pitchforks, to hunt them down. And yet, Nietzsche also observed a human condition, our monsters within, deep down, a desire for control, avoidance of guilt, to blame others before ourselves, is powerful. Reflect then that monsters like Woodford were made, born out of a coalescence of actions. Together we fed his franchise. Together we created the problem. So as an industry, we need help. In the asset management market study, the FCA concluded that fund managers were operating at 36% profit margin, on average. That is, retaining 36% of all revenues from the fund after all other costs had been deducted. But the FCA failed to properly consider the effect of ad valorem fees, the integration of fees within advisory, the effect of supply chains, or the division of wealth between giant asset managers and boutiques. When so many boutiques today are operating at loss due to rising regulatory costs and outflows from asset concentration as a result of supertanker funds and the rise of indexation. When 43% of all IA assets are managed by the top 5 firms, which IA CEO Chris Cummings described as relatively unconcentrated. So before we can consider value for customers, it is worth reminding ourselves if asset management adds value to society. In 2018, financial services contributed $132 billion to the UK economy. That's 26% of the whole UK economy, says the Office of National Statistics. Some numbers then. Financial services provides 1.1 million jobs to the UK, exports worth 60 billion, imports of 15 billion. No actuaries needed then to quickly sum that as a positive surplus of trade of 45 billion, contributing 29 billion to the UK in just tax alone. But only 38,000 jobs were directly employed by asset management, which is managing 9.1 trillion assets, 35% of all assets in Europe, making UK the second largest asset hub after the United States, with 3.1 trillion for non-UK investors, but only 1.7 trillion invested back into the UK economy. When the reported average salary of someone in the city is 51,000, the average investment banker 77,000, or sales director 89,000, according to Glassdoor. And we know that due to a lack of reform of long-term incentive plans, that fund managers' salaries tend to be much, much higher, in the region of 150,000 to 1 million per annum. Star managers like Woodford and Wilno have earned literally hundreds of millions, while CEOs like Larry Fink are earning multi-million salaries per annum. All the while, the UK average salary is only 22,000, according to ONS. The average UK pension, a paltry 21,000 per annum. So does the fund industry, the city, really serve society, or merely serve as a wealth transfer mechanism to those who occupy it, as Marx asserts? That accumulation of wealth at one pole is at the same time the accumulation of misery, agony of toil, slavery, ignorance, brutality, mental degradation at the opposite pole. And the evidence isn't encouraging when the UK household savings ratio, which over the last 10 years has fallen by about half. And whatever your view, in just 10 years, along with banks, the city has lost all or most public perception as being a positive part of our society. And the FCA hasn't fully grasped this question. What is the industry's value to society, wealth mobility, economy, or the environment? Its application of value is narrow in the extremis. Take the FCA's 7 assessment of value considerations. The range of quality of service, the performance of the scheme, the cost of providing services, savings and benefits from economies of scale, the comparable market rate in relation to each separate charge, the AFM's charges for comparable services, and lastly, whether it is appropriate for unit holders in different units to be getting higher charges than those with substantially similar rights. Meanwhile, the public are presented with materialistic images of luxurious super yachts, lavish parties, cars, and properties, best summed up by the FT publication, How to Spend It. So if the value of our society, if the value to our industry is left somewhat debatable, what then for the customer? To help define value, we need to consider if the draining of wealth by asset management through costs and fees is thus parasitic, like vampires, or wealth-generating symbionts. And here our appreciation of monsters again offers the metaphor. Return then our hero, Nosferatu. Take the New England vampire panic a reaction to the outbreak of tuberculosis in the 1800s throughout Rhode Island, eastern Connecticut, Vermont, and other parts of New England. Now, TB infection spreads easily among a family. Thus, when one family member dies of consumption, other members are often quickly infected and gradually succumb. People believe that this was due to the deceased TB sufferer literally draining the life from other family members. In an attempt to protect the survivors and ward off the effects of consumption, bodies of those who had died of the disease were exhumed and examined. The suspected corpse was deemed to be feeding on the living if found to be unusually fresh, especially if the heart or other organs contained liquid blood. Vampirism was of course mistaken for symptoms of TB. And after the blood-sucking culprit was identified, a number of ways were employed to stop the assumed attacks. The most benign of these was simply to turn the body over in its grave. But in other cases, families would burn the fresh organs and rebury the body, or occasionally, the body would even be decapitated. Affected family members would then inhale smoke from the burned organs, or consume the ashes in a further attempt to cure the consumption. One of the more famous cases, that of the sad story of Mercy Brown. Mercy's mother, having contracted consumption, died, quickly spreading TB to the rest of her family, to her sister, her brother, and finally to Mercy. Neighbours believed that one of the family members to be a vampire. 2 months after Mercy's death, her father, George Brown, refusing to believe that a vampire was to blame, reluctantly permitted others to exhume the bodies of his family. They found that Mercy's body showed little decomposition, had fresh blood in her heart, and had turned in her grave. This was enough to convince the villagers that Mercy Brown was the cause of the consumption. The heart of the exhumed body was burnt, mixed with water, and given to her surviving brother to drink in order to stop the influence of the undead. Unsurprisingly, the cure proved somewhat unsuccessful. Vampires then, in keeping with the work of Natalie Lawrence at Cambridge, become our societal embodiment, a revulsion towards parasitic behaviour, the fear of infection, contamination, consumption. But before we start burning organs, let's consider the difference between vampires and symbionts. We can define a vampire as a creature that subsists by feeding on the vital essence, generally in the form of blood, of the living, whereas a symbiotic relationship involves an interaction of symbiont and host, which can affect each other in positive or negative ways, or sometimes not at all. What then to draw from the tale of poor Mercy? What Mercy Brown reminds us of is, where demise and consumption cannot be easily explained by rational means, then society is inherently disposed to assume irrational ones, to assume vampirism. Conclude that morally, we agree to a collective symbiotic good, to giving blood to save others, with consent. Yet, the very notion of vampirism, that for someone to take our blood without permission, is abhorrent, even horrific to us, even if it still gives life to the parasite. Now, symbiosis perhaps best describes how our industry was originally created, and how it indeed perceives itself, versus a parasitic relationship that probably best describes how asset management is increasingly portrayed in the media. Thus, if we agree that the defining difference is one of consent, then so too for value. What is needed for consent is an informed decision. Yet in the shadows many costs lurk, undetected and without clear consent. So I prepared a wee shopping list earlier. Trading costs and dealing spreads, operational and financial costs, regulatory fees and FSCS levy, technology and systems, broker commissions, platform and product costs, index licensing and marketing costs, admin clearing and custodial costs, legal and audit costs, intermediary costs, proxy voting and shareholder services, insurances, facilities and buildings, research, human resources, staff costs and benefits, training and competence, consultants and agencies, hospitality and events, travel costs and expenses, even taxes. most of which are remote to the fund holder. There is no clear consent. But for the fund manager, as agent, these are necessary to manage money today, and it can only manage and control some of these costs to greater and lesser extents. What has changed is the increasing question of whether some costs can simply be taken from the fund holder, or whether moving economic incentives around those costs will help drive down overall costs and thereby raise value for investors. And changes afoot, from RDR to MiFID II regulation to prod guidance. This is just the beginning. The business model is slowly changing. And if perception of value varies by consent, then it must apply to within the agent-principal relationship. When so much is often talked about trust, as if investors should take on faith that our industry just delivers. But this is an old fund order term for describing investors giving up control of their finances. It infers a lack of knowledge, a lack of informed decision. Trust assumes the industry is trustworthy, a lack of trust that there is simply an education piece required to rebuild that trust. It is a very overused word when it comes to the fiduciary obligation. It's only ever the industry that talks about trust, rarely our customers. But trust in some ways is a reciprocal of value. It has to be first earned. It is not that investors should have faith and blindly trust us, but rather as agents we should act in utmost best faith to validate our trustworthiness. It comes down to the misuse of trust as a word, as a term. We should not repeat the same mistake when assessing and asserting value. Consent, on the other hand, is all about informed decision making. To give consent from a behavioural finance standpoint, one presumes that both sides should be informed and economically incentivised for the delivery of the agent, be that agent a fund manager, platform provider, or advisor. But this may not actually be the case. And value for money and the assessment of value too must face this. So take the FCA's latest prescribed 7 considerations, listed here to test if value exists. But agents see additional functions as value accretive too. Number 1, safe custody. Then other areas such as best execution, solvency, communication, ESG, and so on. The list of value add for the agent quickly swells. But for the principal, the end investor, when reading their valuation statement, only performance and cost easily demonstrate value. At best, to them other considerations are secondary, assume merely a utility of the contract for services. At worst, the investor perceives all other functions and services to be parasitic to their investment goals. For example, a soft performance target may pay the fund manager excessive fees when the investor did not understand that was obtainable from the market for a given risk budget or hurdle calculation. Elsewhere, the bundling of fees, a common convenience in centralised investment propositions, confuses charges applicable to the product with those of the investment. Yet further vertically integrated advisor propositions commingle the advice charge with product and investment, often being charged based on ad valorem fees. Administrators and custodians often charge fixed fees that are soft-dollared by adding additional services and tools. These benefits are not necessarily felt by the end investor, and rather than simply affect fund managers, the reach of the assessment of value will ripple up and along the value chains to both advisors and investors, and also down and through the supply chains. Also, any agent-principal mismatch may point to a lack of symmetry in fee structure. And when it comes to fees, perception and economic nudges are important. Time-based fees nudge the agent to charge the principal for longer hours, or else add sufficient clients so as to maximise time that can be invoiced. Ad valorem or size-based fees nudge a firm to grow the scale of its business. It is a fundamental reason we see rising investment into distribution, marketing, leading to asset concentration, star manager herding, and the rise of supertanker funds. And ergo, we see assets overshoot performance due to the lagged narrative employed by sales and marketing. Now, some argue that index providers like Vanguard have made the ad valorem model work by effectively cutting the quoted AMC to zero. That is, this moves the cost to that of a near utility. It removes the incentive to grow size by passing economies back to investors, and this holds some weight. But it's not what we observe from given index providers, which are the fastest growing and largest today. And Vanguard at nearly 5 trillion in assets, we still need transparency of other sources of earnings and subsidies, like stock lending, box profits, and ETF creation redemption admin earnings, to be able to give that informed consent. Arguably in the US, Vanguard has also made ad valorem work for fund holders through mutuality, subsidising fundholder costs through profits. But it's worth noting that Vanguard doesn't fully offer that mutuality outside of the US. By comparison, flat fees are, in economic terms, essentially a utility. Prices are then driven by regulatory need, barriers to entry, service delivery, and competition. Fixed fees are typically charged by suppliers to fund managers, since in doing so they detach themselves from the risk to revenue from asset movements. Sometimes the supplier might add a fee ladder with size-based breakpoints. This again puts the pressure back on the fund manager to build assets. And that nudge to grow puts the focus on asset gathering instead of outcomes to the investor, whom has no or little knowledge of these arrangements. Outcomes-based fees, as noted earlier, incentivise the agent to meet a given hurdle or expectation. They introduce a risk to revenue from performance. Applying a high watermark then, the fund manager will only receive an incentive if the fund exceeds the highest value previously reported. The idea is to ensure that incentives are not paid on the profits that simply offset the losses of previous years. In other words, it rewards consistency rather than boom-bust performance. And yet they may still induce adverse risk-taking or an increased focus on short-term returns. But nonetheless, the fund manager is nudged to earn higher fees through delivering outcomes. The investor will assume they will pay lower fees if the manager fails to deliver. Consider then, an investor assumes the manager is generating value when paying the performance fee. Otherwise, the investor would not be economically incentivised to pay. There would be no consent. On the other side, the agent recognises that if they have not achieved the hurdle, ergo not delivered value, they are prepared to accept lower fees. And this assumption commutes well into whether a fund manager can deliver value or not. Consent is contractually defined. But the difficulty here, for both sides, is the backdrop market return continually fluctuates, and past performance may not necessarily repeat in the future. Hence, fee structures based on profit sharing and mutuality should help align incentives. And they were once commonplace but much rarer today. It is worth noting then that Vanguard in the US is the most successful modern example of a mutual structure. So in any given value chain, different intermediaries may be on different fee structures and therefore subject to different economic biases and nudges. Yet only some are actual agents to the end investor. That's our first problem. Secondly, staff within the agent itself are often subject to very different remuneration, thus subject to very different economic biases. And wealth inequality within asset management firms is widely known, but not widely discussed or addressed. And given that these staff can all affect the outcome to the end investor, that's your next problem. Lastly, simply introducing contingent fees can also incur biases. There can be an information asymmetry here, and most fund fee structures for investors are not negotiable. What then we can see is that contingent fees can still be biased towards the fund manager, like the old 2 and 20, or indeed as many fulcrum fees and structured products are today. Thus, the fee relationship may be skewed from outset if the two parties are not equally matched in terms of information during the fee negotiation. This weakens consent. By comparison, a fee structure, in very rare circumstances, can be biased towards the fund holder, as we have seen with the likes of the radical symmetrical AMC and with clawbacks. Consider why. Contingent outcomes underpins all structured products. The retained gains are effectively a fee upon the investor for removing some of that uncertainty. And we have seen some attempts of fund managers to issue fulcrum-based fee share classes into the wholesale market, but they have drawn only muted responses. Recall that fulcrum fees charge more for better outcomes and less for outcomes below a hurdle. However, the bias may be tilted in favour of the fund manager. So if you haven't already, I commend you all to read the cast paper by Andrew Clare on the symmetrical AMC entitled Heads We Win, Tails You Lose, which came out some years ago. But to date, few managers globally have adopted a symmetrical fee model, and no index trackers to date have done so. And many in the industry say such a fee framework is untenable, as the presence of clawbacks makes earnings too volatile. Indeed, it may be less scalable. How ironic, since fund investors are already exposed to that same volatility. Or perhaps it is because economic nudge to move from ad valorem fees to outcomes-based would be simply too traumatic for agents to grapple with, particularly for those asset managers owned publicly and thus under pressure from their own shareholders. Can you imagine the possible effect on expected cash flows and future value earnings, and how that would be in turn rated by analysts? Agents would have to consider the effect of market movements reducing the scale of assets they could charge against, but also adjust for the variability of returns from investor portfolios. Scary stuff. Nonetheless, of all the fee frameworks, the economic nudges relying some outcomes-based and symmetrical fee models, together with mutual structures, do seem the best aligned to the end investor, the most symbiotic. Again, to take this to its natural conclusion, this has to be considered for the full value chain, not just the fund manager, and that looks very unlikely anytime soon. Thus we can see the importance of fees and how they are linked to value. The divergence of how value is perceived will change again as reported annual costs rise through the likes of MiFID II and PRIPS. And it's easy to observe that the Woodford outcry began to intensify when the firm continued to take fees whilst funds were suspended, as investors quickly increased the perceived value of liquidity and access over all other considerations. It illustrates the lack of symmetry, a complete breakdown in trust. And it was that breakdown of the agent-principal relationship, but more importantly, the rise of perceived vampirism as depicted in the Panorama report. However, given that Neil Woodford is very much still alive, then we should not condone checking his organs for fresh blood, or consuming them to ward off further consumption. But the mob has called for Woodford's expulsion from the industry. And Woodford reminds us that value is then subject to both perception, but also consent, symmetry, and bias. Fee structures do matter, outcomes matter, transparency matters, how the value chain aligns itself matters. So our journey must continue, and so too for Nosferatu, in the shadows, away from the sunlight, to find his next meal. But do not hate him, for he is a monster of our own making. Collectively, we have created monsters, in the absence of a more detailed and nuanced explanation. A perceived vampirism of value grows in the media, and so too amongst the public. Our human condition struggles to appreciate that there can be a duality when it comes to monsters, good and bad. We simply find it easier to portray monsters in binary terms, as wholly, inherently, and exceptionally evil. It helps the rest of us distance ourselves from the monsters. Monsters. Monsters that creep up on us. We choose to cast out these monsters. It plays to our mob mentality, our self-preservation. But we are bad at considering how and why we created the monsters in the first place. The issues belying reach much, much further. Issues well beyond just fund managers that cover all intermediaries, advisors, platforms, research agencies, pension schemes, regulators, media, events, awards, consultants, and suppliers. Issues that have changed little since RDR. So value must deal with the fundamental question of vampirism over symbiosis. Deal with consent, transparency, perception, symmetry, and economic alignment. For far beyond the narrow active-passive debate, value is advised, invested, delivered, supplied, and charged. Up, down, end to end, all along the value chain. Value is both perceived and it is increasingly fragile. Value is the lifeblood of our industry. We are symbionts and need to look after our hosts. And we should be wary of our vampires. Just check who is behind you. Thank you.